Okay, so, we love diving into these old school bodybuilding and fitness programs here on the Deep Dive.
I do, I do.
And you guys have sent over a really interesting one this time.
Yeah.
Two, actually, from the same author, Bryan Kernan. It's Biogenetic 2002, and then an update he did in 2004 called Biogenetic 2004.
Right.
And what's interesting about these is that they're not just like, hey, here's how to work out. They are very specific systems
Yeah, very much so.
with, step-by-step instructions and like a whole, philosophy behind
It's
it.
a system, yeah.
Yeah, a system, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, and actually, before we even get into the specifics, what I think is really cool about these is the author in both of them talks about how he kind of came to these conclusions, right?
Yeah.
And he says that, he was into bodybuilding when he was younger, but he was frustrated because he was like, reading all these magazines and they were telling him all these different things.
Right.
And he felt like none of it was working and none of it was really, based on anything solid. And so he really went and like dove deep into like the scientific literature and started learning from, strength coaches and stuff.
Right.
And so that's what he kind of based these programs on. So it's very much like, okay, this is the result of me overcoming my own frustrations and mistakes.
Yeah, and that kind of shines through in the tone of the documents as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he sort of has that in the back of his mind when he's writing this.
Yeah, it's not just like theoretical. It's very much like, no, this is how I actually got results.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's a really cool kind of backdrop for what we're about to dig into.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess what we should do first is kind of lay out like what are the core ideas here, right? Like what are the main principles of these biogenetic programs?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the most important thing I understand about both of these is the synergistic approach.
Okay.
And what he means by that is that nutrition training and supplementation all work together. So he really emphasizes that you can't just focus on one of those things and ignore the other two.
Right.
And you can't just like swap out parts of his program and expect to get the same results.
It's the whole package deal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he's very clear about that.
It's like baking a cake, right? Like you need the flour, the eggs, the sugar. You can't just leave out the eggs or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that's the core principle.
Okay. So it's about having all these pieces working together in the right way.
Right.
Now, let's talk about the first piece of that, which is nutrition.
Yeah.
Both of these documents place a huge emphasis on nutrition.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, the 2002 one straight up says that the overall number of calories you take in is the single most important thing in your diet when it comes to building muscle.
Okay, so before we even get into macros or anything like that,
It's just total calories.
just cram those calories in.
Basically, yeah. I mean, obviously it's more nuanced than that, but he really stresses the importance of calories. So before you do anything else, figure out what your body composition's like now.
Okay, so that means figuring out like your body fat percentage and your lean muscle mass.
Yeah, exactly. And he suggests using a skin caliper for that.
Okay.
Actually, he even suggests a specific brand, the AccuMeasure.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he links to it in the 2002 one.
Nice.
So yeah, basically you want to know like how much of your weight is fat and how much is muscle.
Yeah, it's establishing that baseline.
Right. And then he gives you a simple way to calculate your lean muscle mass.
Okay, so how does that work?
So let's say you weigh 150 pounds and you have 10% body fat.
Okay.
That means you have 15 pounds of fat and 135 pounds of lean muscle.
Got it.
Easy peasy.
Simple math.
And both documents have a lean muscle mass and body fat worksheet to help you with that.
Okay, so first up, know your numbers, know yourself, know where you're starting from.
Exactly.
Now, once you have that information, how do you figure out how to fuel those muscle gains?
Okay, so once you know your lean body mass, you can calculate how many calories you need each day to build muscle.
Okay.
And the key here is finding that balance.
That balance between
Eating enough to grow, but not so much that you get fat.
Right. Yeah, you don't want to just bulk up and be like, oh, I gained 50 pounds, but it's all fat.
Exactly. Yeah, nobody wants that.
Right.
So the 2002 guide has this whole thing called the biogenetic nutrition formula.
Okay.
And it has 3 parts to it. First, you figure out your resting metabolic rate.
Okay.
Then you factor in your activity level. And then you add 500 calories on top of that for growth.
Okay, so that last part's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
What about the first two? How do you figure out your resting metabolic rate and your activity level?
So for resting metabolic rate in 2002, he says you take your lean body mass in pounds, multiply it by 10, and then add 1,500.
Okay.
So for our example of 135 pounds of lean mass, that would be 3,050 plus 1,500, which equals 2,850 calories.
Okay, so that's just to keep your body functioning at rest.
Yeah, exactly. And then you multiply that by an activity factor. So if you're mostly sedentary, it's 1.2. If you're moderately active, it's 1.4. And if you're very active, it's 1.6.
Okay, so that makes sense. The more active you are, the more calories you burn.
Right.
So you need to eat more.
Exactly.
Got it.
And then finally, you just add 500 calories on top of that for muscle growth.
Okay, so in an example they give in the 2002 guide, it comes out to 4,490 calories per day.
Yeah, that's a lot of food.
That's a lot of food.
But that's what he's recommending for optimal growth.
Yeah, so this is serious bulking territory here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, what about the 2004 guide? Does he do the same calculation there?
So he does a similar calculation, but he changes it up a little bit.
Okay.
So instead of adding 1,500 to your lean body mass times 10, he only adds 500.
Oh, interesting.
So that would mean a lower overall calorie target.
Right, yeah, because you're starting with a lower base number.
Right.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's not clear why he changed it, but it's worth noting.
Yeah, I mean, maybe he just, experimented more and found that that was a better number.
Yeah, good.
Or maybe he was just trying to simplify things.
Right.
Who knows? But it's definitely different.
Definitely different, yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about total calories now. Let's get into the macronutrients, and let's start with protein.
Yep.
Because protein is always a big topic when it comes to building muscle.
It is. It is.
And the 2002 guide actually calls it the most important part of a bodybuilder's diet.
Yeah, he's not messing around.
No, he's not. So what does he recommend in terms of how much protein to eat?
So in 2002, he recommends at least 2.5 grams of protein per pound of body weight.
Whoa. Okay, that's a lot.
It is a lot.
Especially compared to like the typical recommendation of 1 gram per pound.
Right.
So for our 150-pound example, that would be 375 grams of protein per day.
Yeah, that's a lot of chicken breasts.
That's a lot of anything. So
Yeah.
why so much? Why does he think people need that much protein?
So he has a couple of reasons for that.
Yeah.
First, he says that it helps to maintain a positive nitrogen balance in the body, which is essential for muscle growth.
Okay, so it's not just about repairing the damage you do in the gym. It's also about building new tissue.
Right, exactly.
Got it.
And second, he says that protein is less likely to be stored as body fat compared to carbs and fats.
Okay, so it's more likely to be used for muscle building rather than just packing on the pounds.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. And he also addresses the concern about high protein intake and kidney damage.
Yeah, that comes up a lot.
Right, like, oh, if you eat too much protein, it's going to hurt your kidneys.
Right, and he says that the studies that show that are usually done on people who already have kidney problems.
Okay, so if your kidneys are already not functioning properly, then yeah, maybe you shouldn't overload them with protein.
Right.
But if you're healthy...
There's no evidence that a high-protein diet will hurt your kidneys.
Okay, so he's saying don't worry about it unless you have a pre-existing condition?
Basically, yeah.
Okay, so that's a pretty clear stance on protein.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, what about the 2004 guide? Does he change his recommendation there?
He does. He drops it down to 1.5 grams per pound of body weight.
Okay, so still higher than the typical 1 gram.
But it's significantly lower than 2.5.
Yeah, so that's a pretty big change.
Yeah, it is.
I wonder why he did that.
He doesn't really say, but it's something to think about.
Yeah, like maybe he got some feedback from people who are like, dude, I can't eat this much protein.
Right, could be.
Or maybe he just, learned more over time and adjusted his recommendations.
Yeah, possible.
Okay, now, beyond just the quantity of protein, what about the types of protein? Does he talk about that?
Yeah, he does.
What does he say?
So in the 2002 guide, he mentions casein protein,
Okay.
which digests slowly, so it helps to keep you in an anabolic state for longer.
Okay, so that's good for like before bed or when you know you're not going to be eating for a while.
Exactly.
Got it.
And then he also talks about whey protein, which absorbs quickly, so it's good for after a workout.
Okay, so those are the two main types.
Yeah, and he actually recommends a combination supplement that has both casein and whey.
Okay.
But by 2004, he's really emphasizing whey protein.
Really?
Yeah, he calls it a must-have.
Okay.
And he even mentions specific brands like ProLab Pure Whey and HCT 5+1 Whey.
Oh, wow. So he's getting into the specifics now.
Yeah, he is.
And he gives like the nutritional information and the ingredients and even links to buy them.
Yeah, he does.
Okay, so it's becoming more of a product recommendation.
Yeah, you could say that.
Interesting.
And he also lists some good protein sources in the 2004 guide.
Like what?
Like lean meats, fish, poultry eggs, protein powders and bars.
Okay, so pretty standard bodybuilding fare.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about fats.
All right.
Because fats are often demonized, but we know they're important for hormone production and other bodily functions.
Right.
So how do these programs approach fat intake?
So they both recommend that about 15% of your total daily calories should come from fat.
Okay, so not a super low fat diet,
Not super low,
but not super high either.
right? Kind of in the middle.
Okay, and why is that? Why do they think that's the optimal amount?
So they say it's important for maintaining healthy testosterone levels.
Okay, that's crucial for muscle growth
Absolutely.
and also for keeping insulin levels stable.
Right, which is important for overall health and for preventing fat storage.
Okay, so it's not just about building muscle, it's about being healthy overall.
Right.
Right.
And the 2002 guide mentions omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids.
Okay, those are the essential fatty acids that our body needs.
Right, and they recommend Udo's Choice Blend as a good source.
Okay,
And they even link to it.
nice.
So using our 4,490 calorie example from 2002, that would be about 75 grams of fat per day.
Okay, so a decent amount of fat, but not excessive.
Right.
And what about the 2004 guide? Does it say anything different about fats?
It does. It actually
Oh.
distinguishes between saturated and unsaturated fats.
Okay.
And it specifically recommends unsaturated fats.
So things like olive oil, avocados, nuts and seeds.
Exactly.
Okay, and saturated fats are things like butter and fatty meat.
Right.
Okay.
And they mention Udo Erasmus again and his Udo Choice Blend.
Okay, so they're still fans of that.
Yeah, it seems like it.
And they also have this interesting tip about adding safflower oil to your protein shakes.
Really? Yeah, as a way to increase your calorie intake without adding a lot of volume.
Okay, that's a good tip for people who are struggling to eat enough.
Yeah, it is.
Especially if you're trying to eat 4,500 calories a day.
Right.
That's a lot of food.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about protein and fats. Now let's move on to carbs.
Okay.
So carbs are the body's primary energy source.
Right.
But they can also be a source of fat gain if you're not careful.
True.
So how do these programs approach carbs?
So basically, once you've figured out your protein and fat needs, the remaining calories are for carbs.
Okay, so it's like a fill-in-the-blank kind of thing.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, and they both emphasize the glycemic index,
Right.
which is a measure of how quickly a food raises your blood sugar levels.
Right.
And they generally recommend low GI carbs.
Ah.
Okay, why is that?
So they say that low GI carbs cause a slower, more gradual release of insulin,
Okay.
which helps to prevent fat storage and promote fat burning.
Okay, so it's about keeping those blood sugar levels stable.
Right.
And they both have these big lists of approved carb sources,
Oh, yeah, like what?
like fruits, vegetables, dairy products, snacks.
Okay, so lots of options there.
Yeah.
Plenty to choose from.
Okay, so it's not just about the total amount of carbs, but also the types of carbs.
Absolutely.
Okay, now last thing about nutrition. Let's talk about meal frequency.
Okay.
So how often should you be eating according to these programs?
So they both recommend eating 6 to 7 small meals throughout the day.
Okay, so every 2 hours or so.
Yeah, roughly.
Okay, and why is that? Why not just eat 3 big meals?
So they say that eating frequently helps to keep your metabolism high.
Okay, so you're constantly burning calories.
Right.
Got it.
And it also ensures a steady supply of nutrients to your muscles.
Okay, so your muscles are always being fed and they're never starving.
Exactly. And it also helps to prevent fat storage by keeping your blood sugar levels stable.
Okay, so it's kind of like the same reasoning behind eating low GI carbs.
Right.
It's all about stability.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. So we've covered nutrition now. Let's move on to training.
Okay.
So the program emphasizes training smarter, not just harder.
Right.
What does that actually mean in practice?
So the author is very clear that you shouldn't just blindly follow the routines you see in bodybuilding magazines,
Okay.
especially the ones that are used by guys who are on steroids.
Right, because those routines might not be appropriate for natural lifters.
Exactly.
And they might even be dangerous.
Yeah, potentially.
Okay.
So he stresses the need for a more intelligent approach to training,
Okay.
one that's based on scientific principles.
Okay, so what does that look like?
So he starts by defining hypertrophy, which is the process of muscle growth.
Okay.
And he says that that typically occurs with rep ranges of 6-12.
Okay, so that's like the classic muscle building rep range.
Right.
And then he also talks about strength gains,
Right.
which he says are associated with lower rep ranges of 1-5. Okay, so that's more about lifting heavy weight.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so the training program in these guides is a structured 12-week program,
It is.
and it's divided into 3 phases.
Right.
So can you walk us through those phases?
Sure.
What's phase 1?
So phase 1 is called preparation for adaptation,
Okay.
and it lasts for the first 2 weeks.
Okay.
And during this phase, you train 3 times per week.
Okay.
And the exercises are mostly compound movements,
Like what?
like bench press, seated row deadlifts, standing calf raise.
Okay, so big multi-joint movements.
Right.
Okay.
And then there are also some isolation exercises for biceps, triceps, and abs.
Okay, so you're hitting all the major muscle groups?
Yeah.
Okay.
And for each exercise, you do 3 sets with 1 minute rest between sets.
Okay.
And the rep range is pretty high, 15, 25 reps.
Whoa. Okay, that's a lot of reps,
It is.
especially for compound movements.
Yeah, but the weight is going to be lighter.
Right.
It's all about getting the body used to the training stimulus.
Yeah, prepping the muscles for what's to come.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he also prescribes a specific tempo for each rep.
Okay, what does that mean?
So tempo is basically the speed at which you perform each part of the lift.
Okay.
So for example, in phase 1, the tempo is 3-0-1.
Okay, what does that mean?
So the first number 3 refers to the eccentric phase of the lift, which is the lowering phase.
Okay, so you lower the weight for 3 seconds.
Right.
Got it.
The second number 0 is the isometric phase, which is the pause at the bottom of the lift.
Okay, so in this case, there's no pause.
Right.
Okay.
And then the third number 1 is the concentric phase, which is the lifting phase.
Okay, so you lift the weight explosively in 1 second.
Right.
Got it.
So that's what 301 means.
Okay, that's pretty detailed.
Yeah, he's very specific about how you should be performing each rep.
Okay.
And he also incorporates supersets in phase 1.
Okay, what are those?
So supersets are where you perform 2 exercises back to back with no rest in between. So for example, you might do a set of bench presses, followed immediately by a set of seated rows.
Okay, so it's a way to save time and increase the intensity.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he provides a detailed weekly schedule and the specific exercises for all 6 workouts in phase 1.
Okay, so it's all laid out for you.
It is.
Okay, so that's phase 1. Now, what about phase 2?
So phase 2 is called muscle growth acceleration,
Okay.
and it runs for 5 weeks.
Okay, so a little bit longer than phase 1.
Right.
Okay.
And in this phase, you increase the training frequency to 4 workouts per week.
Okay, so you're hitting the gym more often.
Right.
Okay.
And the exercise selection expands to include more movements,
Like what?
like dumbbell bench press, bent over row decline, bench press chin-ups, squats.
Okay, so more variety.
Right.
Okay.
And he also adds in some more isolation exercises for legs, arms, and traps.
Okay, so you're really hitting everything now.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
And the number of sets per exercise increases to 4. And the rest periods are a little bit longer, 1.5 minutes.
Okay.
And the rep range shifts down to 6-12 reps.
Okay, so now we're in the classic hypertrophy range.
Right.
Okay.
And the tempo changes to 4-0-2.
Okay, so a little bit slower on the eccentric and concentric phases.
Right.
Right.
And supersets are still a big part of phase 2.
Okay.
And he gives you detailed workout plans for all 20 workouts in this phase.
Okay, so again, it's all laid out for you.
Okay.
Okay, so that's phase 2. Now what about phase 3?
So phase 3 is called maximum mass and strength.
Okay.
And it lasts for the final 5 weeks of the program.
Okay.
And the training frequency stays at 4 workouts per week.
Okay.
But the exercise selection becomes even more focused on compound movements,
Like what?
like deadlifts, bench press, one-armed row, barbell curls, squats, leg curls.
Okay, so heavy hitters.
Yeah, the big ones.
Okay.
And the number of sets per exercise increases again, this time to 5.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
5 sets of heavy compounds.
That's right.
Intense.
It is. And the rest periods are longer, 2 minutes to allow for heavier lifting.
Makes sense.
And the rep range drops down to 3 to 5 reps.
Okay, so now we're really in the strength building zone.
Right.
Okay.
And the tempo is 2-0-2.
Okay.
And as with the other phases, he gives you detailed workout plans for all 20 workouts in phase 3.
Okay, so it's a very structured program.
Very stressed.
You know exactly what you're doing every day for 12 weeks.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, the 2004 guide had some additional notes about training in general.
Yeah, it did.
What were those?
So it emphasized the importance of keeping your rest periods between sets to 1.5 minutes,
Okay.
because that helps to optimize the release of growth hormone.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about resting your muscles. It's also about hormonal response.
Right.
Got it.
And it also advised against training more than 4 days per week to ensure adequate recovery.
Okay.
And it even suggested just 3 days per week for beginners during their first 6 months of training.
Okay, so starting slow and gradually increasing the volume.
Yeah.
Got it.
And another interesting tip was to sip on a carbohydrate-rich drink like Gatorade between sets during your workouts.
Really?
Yeah.
Why is that?
So the idea is to help block the stress hormone cortisol
Okay.
and to maintain energy levels throughout your workout.
Okay, that makes sense.
And they even recommend mixing 2 scoops of powder per liter of water
Okay.
and optionally adding a teaspoon of glutamine.
Okay, so it's like a little intra-workout cocktail.
Yeah, you could say that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered nutrition and training.
Yeah.
Now for the third piece of the puzzle, supplementation.
Right.
So the program talks about this killer stack.
It does.
Yeah.
What does that entail?
So basically the idea is that supplementation is the final piece you need to really accelerate your results.
Okay.
But the author is also kind of skeptical of the supplement industry.
Yeah.
He says that a lot of companies prioritize marketing over product quality.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of hype in the supplement world.
Yeah, for sure.
So he recommends 2 key supplements in both the 2002 and 2004 guides.
Okay, what are those?
Mag-10 and 1AD.
Okay, I've heard of those.
Yeah.
What are they all about?
So Mag-10 is a supplement from Biotest,
Okay.
and it's marketed as a very effective muscle builder.
Okay.
They claim you can gain up to 20 pounds of muscle in just 8 weeks.
Whoa, okay, that's a bold claim.
It is.
Okay.
And he provides links to buy Mag-10 in both guides.
Okay.
And in the 2002 guide, he includes some pretty wild testimonials,
Like what?
like 12.5 pounds in 2 weeks.
Really?
Yeah,
That's crazy.
it is. And another one says 14 pounds in 12 days.
Wow.
Yeah, so people are claiming some pretty dramatic results.
Yeah, I mean, those are pretty anecdotal, but still impressive.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, what about 1AD?
So 1AD is a prohormone,
Okay.
and it converts to 1-testosterone in the body,
Okay.
which is said to be way more powerful than regular testosterone,
Like how much more powerful?
like 700% more potent.
Whoa, okay.
Yeah, it's serious stuff. And it also doesn't convert to estrogen.
Which is good.
Yeah, because estrogen can lead to unwanted side effects like water retention and gynecomastia.
Right. Man boobs.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Okay.
And he provides a link to buy 1AD in the 2004 guide.
Okay.
And he also gives a detailed product description,
Okay.
highlighting its high oral bioavailability,
Okay.
the fact that it doesn't convert to estrogen,
Right.
and that it causes less water retention than other similar compounds.
Okay, so it sounds like he's really pushing 1AD in the 2004 guide.
Yeah, it seems like it.
Okay, so those are the 2 key supplements.
Yeah.
How does he recommend incorporating them into the 12-week program?
So he has this thing called the 12-week biogenetic stack,
Okay.
and it's a cycle.
Okay.
You take both 1AD and Mag-10 for 2 weeks.
Okay.
2 servings of 1AD per day and 1 serving of Mag-10 per day.
Okay.
And then you take 4 weeks off,
Okay.
and then you repeat that cycle for the entire 12 weeks.
Okay, so 2 weeks on, 4 weeks off.
Right.
Got it.
And he emphasizes the importance of taking the supplements every day during the on weeks.
Even on non-workout days.
Right.
Okay, why is that?
So the idea is to maintain a consistent level of the supplements in your system.
Okay, so it's not just about taking them around your workouts. It's
Right.
about keeping those levels elevated.
Exactly.
Okay, now the 2004 guide also had this editor's note about prohormones.
Right.
What was that about?
So basically it was acknowledging that the FDA was considering banning prohormones.
Right, yeah, there was a lot of controversy around those back then.
Yeah.
And I think they did eventually ban them, or at least most of them.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
But the editor's note was basically saying that even if prohormones are banned, you can still make great progress with just the diet and training program.
Okay, so the supplements are like a bonus.
Kind of.
Right.
But they also included a disclaimer saying that prohormones should only be used by men over 21.
Okay, yeah, that's important.
Definitely.
Because teenagers are already producing a lot of testosterone naturally. They don't need to be messing with their hormones.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a responsible disclaimer.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Were there any other supplements that he specifically recommended?
Yeah, there was one more in the 2004 guide.
Okay, what was that?
Tribex.
Tribex. Okay, I've never heard of that one.
Yeah, it's also from Biotest,
Okay.
and it's marketed as a natural libido and energy booster.
Okay.
And it works by stimulating the body's production of luteinizing hormone, or LH.
LH. Okay.
Yeah, and LH is important because it signals the testes to produce testosterone.
Okay. So it's kind of an indirect way to boost testosterone.
Right.
Okay.
And he recommends Tribex as a way to help maintain natural testosterone production,
Okay.
especially when you're using other supplements that might suppress your natural testosterone.
Like 1AD.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's kind of like a counterbalance.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay.
And he also mentions the role of an ingredient called avena sativa,
Okay.
which is said to help free up bound testosterone.
Okay, so it's making more of your existing testosterone available.
Right.
Okay,
yeah.
that's interesting.
And the recommended dosage for Tribex is 3 capsules in the morning and 3 in the afternoon,
Okay.
taken with food.
Okay.
And he suggests cycling it 4 weeks on 2 weeks off.
Okay.
And of course, he provides links to buy Tribex.
Of course.
Yeah, he's very thorough.
Yeah, he doesn't miss a trick.
No.
Okay. So we've covered the main supplements now.